My father called me a disappointment 40 seconds before he found out I owned 61% of his company. He didn't say it to my face. He said it in a hallway outside a 10th-floor conference room in downtown Columbus. To his own lawyer, 12 feet from the door I was about to walk through under a name he'd read a dozen times on a term sheet and never once connected to me. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning Stories, where the people everyone counted out turn out to be the ones holding the paperwork. If you've ever been the name your family used as a cautionary tale at Thanksgiving, stay with me to the end, because what happened in that hallway took me 22 years to build and about 40 seconds to finish. But if I start there, none of it will make sense. So let me take you back, not to that hallway, but to a kitchen table in Millbrook, Ohio, 2 streets over from a steel plant that's been running since 1961. I'm Elizabeth Whitmore. Everyone in Millbrook still calls me Beth. Everyone in my office in Columbus calls me Eliza Cole, which is my mother's maiden name, and that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. I'm 39. I run a small private equity fund called Harborline Capital Partners out of a converted warehouse off North High Street. 3 people, 1 Bloomberg terminal we all fight over, and a coffee maker older than most of our portfolio companies. We do one specific, unglamorous thing. We find manufacturing businesses that are about to die from bad management instead of bad luck, and we fix the management. I know how to do that because I grew up watching one almost happen in real time at a company called Whitmore Steel and Fabrication, founded by my grandfather Walter in 1961, run by my father Richard since 1994, and until 8 months ago, quietly owned in majority by a fund with my name on the paperwork and my face nowhere near the meetings. My grandfather built that company out of a Quonset hut and a single arc welder. By the time I was a kid, it had grown into a 214-person operation making structural steel components for construction crews across 3 states. Everyone in Millbrook knew the Whitmore name. Half the men on my street had worked a shift there at some point. My father grew up expecting to run it. My older brother Mark grew up expecting the same thing, 1 generation later, and nobody ever really asked him if he wanted it. He just did. Nobody asked me either. The difference is, I wanted something else, and in my family, wanting something else had a name. Selfish. Difficult. Not a team player. I was the kid who liked numbers in a family that liked steel. My grandfather noticed before anyone else did. When I was 12, he sat me down at his kitchen table with a spiral notebook, the actual one, cracked spine, coffee ring on the cover, where he'd sketched his very first cost breakdown for the company back in 1961. Cost of raw stock, cost of labor, cost of a truck payment, margin, if you could call it that, of about 4 cents a pound. He tapped the page and said, "Most people in this family look at a number and see a number. You look at a number and ask what it's hiding. Keep asking that." Then he gave me the notebook. Not Mark. Me. I didn't understand yet what that meant. I understood it a lot better 16 years later, in a conference room, holding a different set of numbers that were hiding something much bigger than 4 cents a pound. I want to tell you about the thing my family still brings up, 22 years after my grandfather handed me that notebook, whenever they want to remind me of my place. It happened when I was 24. I'd studied finance at Ohio State, worked 2 years as a junior analyst at a regional bank in Columbus, and in 2010 I quit to start a small company called Ledgerline, inventory and cash flow software for tiny manufacturers, the kind of businesses too small for the expensive enterprise tools and too complicated for a spreadsheet. I built the first version myself. I got 11 paying customers, and I needed $40,000 to get from 11 customers to something that could survive a real sales cycle. My father gave me that $40,000. I want to be fair, because he did. He drove to Columbus, sat in my one-room office above a dry cleaner, looked at my projections, and wrote a check. He told me, and I remember the exact words, "I'm not doing this because I think you'll succeed. I'm doing it because your grandfather would want me to." Ledgerline lasted 18 months. I lost a key contract to a competitor with better funding, missed payroll twice, and closed it down myself in the spring of 2012 rather than let it die slowly. I called my father before I told anyone else. I told him I'd pay him back, every dollar, and it took me 4 years, but I did. He never once, in those 4 years, asked how the repayment was going. What he did instead was mention the $40,000 at almost every family gathering for the next decade. Not cruelly, exactly. Casually. The way you mention a scar. Beth's the one who tried the whole entrepreneur thing. We don't let Beth near the family investments anymore, huh? At my cousin's wedding in 2015, 3 years after I'd already paid every cent back, my aunt asked what I was up to for work, and before I could answer, my father said, "She's an analyst now." After the app thing. The app thing. That was the whole sentence. 9 years of a finance career, reduced to 2 words, delivered with a small, indulgent laugh that told the table exactly how to feel about me. That's the sentence that followed me into every room in my family for the next 15 years. Not what I built afterward. What I lost once, at 24, trying. Here's what pain does when you don't get to talk about it. It stacks. It doesn't arrive once and leave. It shows up in small deposits, and you don't total the account until much later. Deposit 1. Thanksgiving, 2016. My father stood up during dinner to toast Mark's promotion to Vice President of Operations. Mark was 31. My father said, and I remember this clean, word for word, "This company's future is safe because we've got a Whitmore who actually shows up for it." I was sitting 4 feet away. I had shown up for every single Thanksgiving of my adult life. I just hadn't shown up on the org chart. Deposit 2. 2018, the company's anniversary event. A banquet hall rented out for 300 people, employees and their families, a slideshow of leadership running on a loop by the bar. My photo wasn't in it. My cousin's husband, who joined the sales team 8 months earlier, was. I asked my mother about it afterward, gently, not looking for a fight. She said, "Oh, honey, that's just the people who work there. You work somewhere else." As if the somewhere else had been my idea alone, and not also theirs. Deposit 3. The one that still catches in my chest a little. My grandfather's funeral, October 2019. My father gave the eulogy. He talked about the Quonset hut, the arc welder, the 4 cents a pound, all of it, beautifully, honestly. He talked about Mark carrying the company into its next chapter. He did not say my name once, not even in the part where he thanked family for their support, even though I'd driven to my grandfather's house every single Sunday for the 2 years before he died, sitting with him while he retold the same 3 stories, because by then his memory was going, and I was the only one with the patience to hear them again. At the reception, my father handed Mark our grandfather's pocket knife and his watch, in front of everyone, a small ceremony he'd clearly planned. Nobody handed me anything in public. What I had was already at home, in a drawer, wrapped in a dish towel. A cracked spiral notebook nobody else in that room remembered existed. Deposit 4. 2016, a rough patch at the plant, a cash crunch from a slow receivables cycle. I was 29, 4 years into restructuring work by then, and I gently suggested my father look at factoring the receivables instead of drawing down the line of credit. He looked at me the way you look at a child who's wandered into an adult conversation and said in front of Mark, "Let's leave the real business decisions to people who've actually run something successful." I didn't bring it up again. I went home, opened a savings account I didn't tell anyone about, and put $100 in it. I don't think, if you'd asked me that night, I could have told you exactly why. I know now. I was starting a fund. I just didn't have a name for it yet. Deposit 5, the smallest and somehow the one that stayed longest. My mother, folding laundry in 2020, saying, without much thought behind it, "You know your father worries about you. Financially, I mean. He doesn't think you have anything steady." I was at that point a senior associate at a turnaround advisory firm with a base salary higher than my father's, and neither of my parents had ever once asked me what it was. I didn't get angry, not in any way you'd notice from the outside. I got quiet, and I got specific, and I built a career the slow, unglamorous way, which is the only way I've ever seen it actually work. I spent 6 years at a regional bank in Columbus doing credit analysis on small manufacturers, which meant reading their financial statements for a living, which meant learning exactly what a healthy company looks like on paper and exactly what a company sliding toward trouble looks like 6 quarters before anyone inside it wants to admit it. Then 5 years at a turnaround advisory firm, the kind that gets called in when a business is 90 days from missing payroll, where I learned that most companies don't fail because the product is bad. They fail because somebody in charge stopped reading the numbers closely enough to be honest with themselves. In 2020, with 2 former colleagues, I started Harboline Capital Partners. Small fund, first close of $11 million, mostly from people who'd watched me work for a decade and trusted my judgment more than my resume. I used my mother's maiden name, Cole, on the fund documents and every piece of public-facing material, and I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't shame, or wasn't only shame. It was strategy. I didn't want a single seller, banker, or lender in Ohio hearing Whitmore and running a mental file on my father's company before they'd even looked at my numbers. I wanted to be evaluated on the work. So Beth Whitmore became a name I used at Christmas, and Eliza Cole became a name I used everywhere a decision actually got made. I never once told my family what Harborline did. When my mother asked, at a birthday dinner in 2021, I said, investing, mostly in manufacturing, and she nodded the way you nod at a sentence you've already decided isn't very interesting and passed the rolls. If you've ever been the name people used as a warning at family dinners, stay with me, because the next part is where 15 years of being underestimated started quietly paying interest. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. Whitmore Steel started slipping in 2021, and it slipped the way most companies do. Not with one dramatic collapse, but with a series of small, defensible-sounding decisions that added up to something nobody wanted to say out loud. Mark, running operations by then, signed a 3-year fixed-price supply contract with a large general contractor in the spring of 2021, locking in steel component pricing before the industry saw its worst raw material spike in 40 years. By the fall, the company was fabricating steel at a loss on almost a third of its active jobs because the price of raw coil had climbed nearly 60% and the contract didn't allow for adjustment. Nobody had put an escalation clause in the paperwork. My father found out about the gap the same month the bank did, when the line of credit request came back larger than the plant's entire annual payroll. By early 2023, Whitmore Steel owed its bank just over $4 million, was 6 weeks from missing a payroll cycle for the first time in company history, and had a covenant violation on its books that gave the bank the legal right to call the entire loan due immediately. My father, who had spent his whole career being the man who wrote checks, was suddenly the man who needed one, and the bank had already told him, politely, that they weren't interested in extending more credit to a company with his current numbers. I found out about all of this the way I found out about most things at that plant, secondhand, at a family dinner, filtered through my mother's careful phrasing. "Things are a little tight right now," she said, stirring her coffee, not looking at me. "Your father's talking to some people about, I don't know, refinancing or something." I already knew, actually. I'd known for 3 weeks. Whitmore Steel's covenant breach had shown up on a distressed manufacturer list my analyst runs every Monday morning, the same list we use to find every deal we do. Here's the part one needs you to sit with for a second, because it's the part that decided everything that came after. A regional bank doesn't want to be the lender that forecloses on a 63-year-old family manufacturer and puts 214 people out of work in a town of 9,000. Banks hate that outcome. What they want is a private buyer who'll step in, restructure the balance sheet, and let the bank walk away clean. My firm gets calls like that constantly. In April of 2023, we got one about Whitmore Steel and fabrication, and I recognized the address before I finished reading the first sentence. I could have walked away. I want to be honest that I thought about it for about a day. Then I thought about 214 employees who had nothing to do with a bad fixed-price contract, people whose kids I'd gone to school with, and I thought about a plant my grandfather built with an arc welder and a notebook he'd handed to me instead of my brother, and I decided the company deserved to survive its owner's mistakes, even if the owners hadn't necessarily earned the same second chance. I structured the deal the way I structure every deal, through a holding entity, Millbrook Bridge Holdings, one of several SPVs Harborline uses, so that any given transaction gets evaluated purely on the numbers, without a seller adjusting their behavior because they know who's on the other side of the table. My 2 analysts ran diligence. I read every document twice, a habit I've had since Ledgerline, since the year I learned what happens when you sign something you only half read. I never once personally got on a diligence call. My father spent 4 months negotiating with people named Priya and David, and occasionally me, over email signed E. Cole. He never asked what the E stood for. The final structure was a $2.4 million mezzanine facility in June 2023, convertible into equity if the company missed its covenants again within 18 months. It missed them in November 2024. Under the terms my father's own attorney had reviewed and approved, Millbrook Bridge Holdings converted into 61% ownership of Whitmore Steel and Fabrication, controlling interest in a company my grandfather built, now legally on paper mine. I found out something else during that diligence process that I didn't go looking for. In September 2024, at a Sunday dinner, I was clearing plates and saw a printed memo on the kitchen counter, addressed to my father, titled Workforce Contingency Plan. I read it while I rinsed a dish, because that's a habit too. It outlined a plan to lay off 40 floor positions, all union, all long-tenured, before touching a single executive salary or bonus, in case the new ownership group forced cost reductions. My father and my brother had already decided, quietly, who would absorb the pain of their own mistake. It wasn't going to be them. I put the memo back exactly where I found it. I didn't say anything. I just knew, from that point forward, exactly what I was going to require in writing before I let a single dollar of my fund's money finish that deal. For most of a year, my family talked about the investors, the way people talk about whether they can't control. Some faceless private equity group out of Columbus, tightening things, asking uncomfortable questions, requiring monthly reporting my father found insulting. My mother mentioned it at Christmas 2024, not knowing, obviously, that she was describing me across her own table. They want reports on everything now, she said. It's very impersonal. Your father says they don't even have the decency to show up in person. I asked, careful to sound only mildly curious, what the company was doing about it. My father said, writing it out, whoever they are, they'll get bored eventually. Investors always do. Meanwhile, at that same table, in front of my aunt, my cousin's husband, and Mark's wife Jenna, my father found a way to work in, unprompted, that I'd once lost $40,000 of his money on some app. 15 years later, while actively losing his company to a covenant default at that very moment, I sat there with a glass of sparkling water, the same thing I always order, my one small quirk nobody in my family has ever asked me about. I thought about the notebook in my grandfather's handwriting, sitting in a drawer 40 minutes from that table. I thought not yet, but soon. The quarterly ownership review was scheduled for the second Tuesday of October 2025, 10 months after the conversion, the first One Harborline's fund required to happen in person instead of over video. My father's counsel had requested it be held at Whitmore Steel's own boardroom, which I agreed to, partly out of respect, and partly because I wanted to see the plant floor one more time before anyone knew who I was. I arrived 20 minutes early, the way I always do, wearing the same charcoal blazer I wear to every closing, no jewelry except a mechanical pencil clipped inside my folio, the one my grandfather used to fill out that first notebook. My analyst, Priya, walked ahead of me toward the conference room. That's when I heard my father's voice in the hallway, talking to his attorney, both of them unaware I was already close enough to hear every word. You know what really gets me, my father was saying, is that if I had a real family member I could hand this to right now, someone who actually understood the numbers, I wouldn't be sitting here waiting on some faceless fund to decide my company's future. My own daughter couldn't keep a two-person startup alive without losing my money. And now I've got strangers in Columbus telling me how to run something my father built with his hands. His attorney said something about the meeting starting soon. My father laughed, short and humorless. At least Mark shows up. Beth just shows up for Christmas. I want you to understand, I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I'd rehearsed anger for months without meaning to. What I actually felt, standing in that hallway, was very calm, and a little sad, and completely, finally certain. I walked in. My father saw me before anyone said a word. I watched it happen in real time, the specific, physical process of a person's understanding catching up to their eyes. Confusion first. Then his gaze flicked to Priya, back to me, to the empty chair at the head of the table, clearly reserved for someone named E. Cole. Then the color left his face the way it does when a person realizes a sentence they said out loud 30 seconds ago is about to become permanently, irreversibly true. Beth, he said, what are you doing here? The company's counsel, a man named Douglas, who'd worked with my father for 11 years and had never once met the actual managing partner of the fund, holding his clients' controlling shares, stood up to make the introduction he'd prepared. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like you to formally meet Eliza Cole, managing partner of Harborline Capital, representing Millbrook Bridge Holdings. Nobody in that room needed him to finish the sentence. Mark's face went through the same sequence as my father's, half a beat behind. My father sat down slowly, like his legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of him. "You're Eliza Cole," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a man rereading 18 months of paperwork in his head, all at once, and finding my initials in every signature line he'd skimmed past. "I'm both," I said. I sat down in the chair that had my name on it, the real one, the only one that had ever really mattered. "I have been the whole time." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, not performing for anyone now because there was no audience left to perform for, "The $40,000. I paid that back in 2016, I said. "Every dollar, with interest, into an account you never checked. I built a fund on the discipline. I learned losing it. Ledgerline didn't fail because I wasn't built for this, Dad. It failed because I was 24 and undercapitalized. Turns out that's a very fixable problem given time." I opened my folio and set it flat on the table, my grandfather's pencil resting in the crease. This company had the same problem. Undercapitalized, and run by people who stopped reading their own numbers closely enough to catch it in time. I read them. "That's the whole difference between us." Mark finally spoke. "This is insane. You've been sitting on our diligence calls this whole time and you never." "I was never on your diligence calls," I said. "My analysts were. I read every document they sent me, twice, which is more attention than this company's own leadership gave the contract that put it into covenant default in the first place." I didn't raise my voice. I've learned that the quietest sentence in a room is usually the one people remember. My father looked, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely lost. And I want to tell you honestly, some small part of me still ached at that, because underneath everything, he's still my father, and watching someone realize the floor moved under them isn't something I actually enjoyed, even after 15 years of the app thing. "So what happens now?" he said. Not defiant, just tired. "Now we talk about terms," I said. "The same way I would with any owner whose company I control. No different, because you're my father. Actually, a little more carefully, because you're my father." I laid out 3 things, calmly, the way I would in any boardroom. First, the 40 union floor positions outlined in a workforce contingency plan I'd happened to see the previous September stayed protected. Minimum 3 years, written directly into the recapitalization terms, before a single dollar touched an executive bonus. My father's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. Second, Mark would keep his title, but the company was bringing in a professional chief operating officer to rebuild the contracting and pricing process, and Mark would report to that person and requalify for VP authority over 18 months based on documented performance, the same standard any outside hire would face. Third, and this was the one that mattered most to me personally, my father would move to a non-executive chairman role, honorary, no operational authority, for a 2-year transition, with his full pension and benefits protected, and then retire with the dignity of a man who built something that outlasted his mistakes, instead of a man forced out of a building he no longer controlled. "And you?" my mother asked me later that week on the phone, her voice careful in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "What do you get out of all this?" "I get to keep the notebook," I told her, though that's not really what I meant. What I actually get is a controlling stake in a company I already spent 2 years quietly saving, and no interest in taking a personal salary from it, because that was never the point. The fund's profit share from the deal is going into a trades apprenticeship fund for employees' kids, seeded the same month my grandfather's plant turned 65. He gave a notebook to the person who asked what the numbers were hiding. I decided the fund should go to the next kid who asks the same question. It's been 8 months. My father comes to the honorary board meetings now. He's quieter than I remember him being for most of my life, which I think is its own kind of answer. He hasn't said the word sorry, not directly, not yet, and I've stopped waiting for it the way I used to. What he has done, twice, is ask me actual questions about how I evaluate a distressed deal, the way you'd ask a colleague, not a daughter. It's not everything. It's something. Mark is 9 months into his 18-month review. He's better at it than I expected. Honestly, once the pressure of being the assumed heir got replaced by the clarity of an actual scorecard. My mother called me the week after the meeting, not to apologize exactly, but to say something I think about often. I always thought you walked away from this family, she said. I never once considered you might have been the only one still holding it up. I didn't correct the timeline for her. I just said thank you and I meant it. I still keep my grandfather's notebook on the corner of my desk at Harborline. The coffee ring still visible, the pages still soft at the edges. Every so often a young analyst picks it up, curious, and asks what it is. I tell them the truth. It's the first ledger of a company that almost forgot what built it, and it's the reason I never stopped believing that being underestimated is just information nobody's finished reading yet. If your family ever decided who you were before you got the chance to become it, I hope this reminded you the story isn't over just because they stopped watching. Some people only take you seriously once the numbers force them to. That's not forgiveness. It's just math, finally catching up to the truth. If someone in your life wrote you off years ago and would be stunned to learn what you actually built since then, would you tell them? Or would you let them keep believing the version of you that was easiest for them to dismiss? Tell me in the comments. And if this one hit home, subscribe, because next time, it's someone else's turn to prove them wrong.